Throughout the last century, humanity as a whole has achieved some incredible feats, but not all have come without a cost. As our technology and capabilities advance, corners were cut and mistakes were made. Some of the world's worst disasters can be attributed to simple human error, disasters that came at the cost of not only money, but many human lives. From the most destructive wildfire in California's history to a chemical explosion at a Chinese port, here are 5 of the worst man-made disasters, Part 2. Buried deep in the Earth's crust are vast reservoirs of fossil fuels and crude oil. They are natural resources that we have come to heavily rely on. Cars, ships, airplanes, all of them require these resources to operate. Because of this, the drilling and transportation of these resources has become a multi-billion-dollar per year industry. But it's also an incredibly dangerous one, as the slightest miscalculation or accident can cause an immense amount of environmental damage. Such was the case of the Exxon Valdez. On the morning of March 23, 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez left the port of Valdez, Alaska, on its way for Long Beach, California. On board the massive ship was 53 million gallons of crude oil. Just after midnight of March 24th, the ship struck Bligh Reef, which was a relatively well-known navigation hazard in Prince William Sound, where the accident took place. The impact ripped a huge gash in the ship's hull and allowed 11 million gallons of oil to spill out into the water. At the time, it was the largest oil spill in American history, until the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on April 20th, 2010. Over 1,300 miles of coastline were covered in oil, killing hundreds of thousands of marine animals. For months after the spill, teams worked around the clock to clean up shorelines and save distressed animals. The teams were comprised of federal responders, Exxon employees, and over 11,000 Alaskan volunteers. Around $2 billion was spent in cleanup costs and another $1.8 billion for habitat restoration. The subsequent investigation revealed that, at the time, the ship's captain was drunk and had left his third mate, who was unlicensed, to steer the ship. In spite of the incredible environmental damage done and the billions of dollars spent, the captain was eventually acquitted of felony charges and was only convicted of a single charge of misdemeanor negligence. Anyone who knows anything about California will tell you that there are 2 types of disasters that the state is prone to: earthquakes and wildfires. Of course, earthquakes are not caused by humans. The majority of wildfires aren't either, most often being caused by lightning strikes or trees falling onto electrified structures like power lines. From time to time, though, fires are sparked by something that is man-made. In 2018, a wildfire that came to be known as the Camp Fire raged out of control. It started in the northern part of the state when an outdated power line failed, sending out sparks to vegetation that had been severely dried out from a lack of rainfall. The sparks almost immediately took to the tinder below, where it grew into a massive blaze. To make matters worse, the area was very windy. With nearly unlimited fuel and a strong wind to give it oxygen, the fire grew at a very rapid pace. For weeks, the fire burned uncontrolled, eventually pushing towards a heavily populated area. With over 1,000 firefighters battling the blaze, the fire was finally contained after 17 days. During that time, the fire destroyed an area that was the size of Chicago. When the fire was finally extinguished, there was little time to be happy, as over 14,000 residences were destroyed in its wake. 85 people lost their lives, and another 296 went unaccounted for. Soon after, the company responsible for the blaze filed for bankruptcy, citing liability costs of over $30 billion. The company ended up having to pay roughly half of that, with $1 billion going to the government and $11 billion to insurance companies. America, along with many other countries throughout the world, have very strict rules and regulations when it comes to safety in the workplace. Yeah, they may get annoying, but the rules are there for a reason. In some countries, though, things happen in a bit of a different way. Either governments don't have rules, they don't enforce them, or the officials can be bribed so that the company can ignore them altogether. It is what led to one of the most destructive and deadly industrial accidents in Chinese history. In the city of Tianjin, China, there was a warehouse which contained huge amounts of hazardous and flammable chemicals. In one part of the warehouse, a highly flammable chemical, nitrocotton, had been allowed to dry out. On August 12, 2015, it self-ignited, causing a fire that spread to some of the other chemicals around it. Firefighters responded quickly, but things were getting out of control at a very fast rate. Suddenly, there was an explosion with power that was equivalent to nearly 3 tons of TNT. Only a few seconds later, a second explosion occurred, dwarfing the first. It was the equivalent of nearly 15 tons of TNT. Not only did it destroy the warehouse and leave a giant crater where it once was, over 300 homes in the area were destroyed and 173 people lost their lives. The investigation that followed revealed some startling things. The warehouse owners had been bribing city officials and authorities to sidestep safety regulations and illegally store dangerous chemicals. These chemicals are the ones that caused the explosions. In total, 49 staff and government officials were jailed for their role in this disaster. In 2005, one of the most destructive storms in American history came offshore near the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. We are, of course, talking about Hurricane Katrina. But in a video about man-made disasters, why are we covering a natural disaster? This is because, with this particular hurricane, most of the damage came from the failure of over 50 levees and flood walls that were built to protect New Orleans and its surrounding suburbs. Katrina struck just east of New Orleans in Mississippi. Although it technically made landfall as a Category 3 storm, it was in the process of weakening from being a powerful Category 5 storm. New Orleans and surrounding areas had various levees and flood walls built to protect against the ocean in the event that a hurricane or other powerful storm hit. Sadly, there were widespread failures in these structures, resulting in over 80% of the city of New Orleans being flooded. These various levees and barriers were designed and built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, while maintenance belonged to local levee boards. At the time that the storm came in, the Army Corps were in the process of completing various projects on the levees, with most being between 60 to 90% complete. 4 major investigations were conducted by civil engineers, and all found that the reason for the failures was due to inadequate design and construction by the Army Corps. In April of 2006, months after investigation revealed what happened, the Army Corps finally admitted a problem with its design. In terms of man-made disasters, there can hardly be a discussion without mentioning the Chernobyl nuclear reactor meltdown. It is unique for a number of reasons, mainly due to outdated technology and poor training. But there were quite a bit of politics that played a role in the immediate handling of the disaster and the aftermath. After all, Ukraine was under the rule of the Communist Soviet Union. In 1986, during a test at low power, the nuclear reaction inside Reactor 4 got out of control. This resulted in a huge explosion that blew the top off of the reactor and the roof off the building, releasing incredible amounts of nuclear radiation into the atmosphere. The actual explosion killed 2 people. The nearby town of Pripyat, where the factory's workers and their families lived, was the first place for these radioactive particles to travel. The entire town had to be evacuated. Fire crews were called to try and control the blaze. Within 3 months, 28 of them had died from acute radiation sickness. Over the years, many thousands of other people were reported to have died due to complications from radiation exposure. There was a number of problems that contributed to this meltdown being as disastrous as it was. First, the workers conducting the test on the day of the explosion were not adequately trained. Also, rescue crews did not have the right equipment to handle a disaster of this type. Finally, as Ukraine was under Soviet control, the communist country did everything it could to conceal and downplay this disaster. Help was turned away, people were given false narratives in order to keep peace, and actual witnesses to the events were silenced. All of these things surely led to more casualties than there needed to be. Industrial accidents are especially some of the most damaging simply because the various businesses and corporations have to use all sorts of chemicals in order to manufacture their goods. These chemicals can do everything from catch fire and explode to simply evaporate, turning into a noxious and toxic gas that is dangerous to anyone or anything unfortunate enough to breathe it in. This is what brings us to the Lombardy region of Italy. The area was home to a chemical manufacturing plant that was only about 20 miles north of the city of Milan. Here, workers were attempting to make a chemical called trichlorophenol by way of combining two other chemicals in a controlled environment which would cause a reaction. Just after noon on July 10, 1976, the complex process was underway. However, there were a number of mechanical failures that allowed the temperatures of the chemicals to climb much higher than they should have. To make matters worse, the sensors that were supposed to detect these things failed, resulting in an incredibly poisonous gas being created without anyone's knowledge. Standard procedure called for venting the gases out of the building, but nobody was prepared for exactly what that was about to do. The 6 tons of chemical gas that were vented ended up settling on over 6.9 square miles of the surrounding area. The most affected area was the town of Seveso, where a few hundred people had skin inflammation from the chemicals. What suffered the most was the environment in the area, where tens of thousands of animals had to be exterminated and farmland was rendered useless. It was later found that there were no safety features at the plant that could have prevented something like this, except for a warning system for a small explosion. Disasters are terrible things. At least with natural disasters, we can take some sort of solace in the fact that we have no control over them. But when it comes to man-made disasters, we are suddenly faced with the notion that the profits may not be worth the risk when taking everything from human error to failing technology into account. To see more videos just like this one, be sure to click the link on screen now. With that, thank you for watching, and tune in next time.